Good morning and good afternoon to everyone that has been connecting from any part of the world in order to gather and celebrate the International Women's Day. The International Institute of UNESCO for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean is going to have this seminar online, which will have preliminary data from a pilot survey that was performed throughout the region, which also talks about violence against women in universities and analyzes this reality with a group of extraordinary panelists. Now on November 25th, due to the elimination of violence against women, UNESCO IESALC summoned 4 women from different higher education institutions throughout Latin America and the Caribbean in order to take part in a regional campaign so that all personnel and students could come together and state if they have suffered any sort of violence within campus. Violence against women is a universal phenomenon, and higher education institutions are no exception. That is why we require firm and strict management so that there will be no more hostility within these different higher education campuses. And this is a reality that we face now. But before we begin with today's program, we would like to extend an invitation regarding the participation of assistants to this event. And for that, I would like to show a question in which the audience can answer directly through means of maybe the question that is to be shared on the screen. You can access it by scanning the QR code, and it is the following. Have you ever been within a gender-based violence situation at your institution? Again, have you ever been involved in a gender-based violence situation within your institution? The code to this question is 2544-9954. The idea is that you can also take part and tell right here live all of your testimonies. While you're answering this question, we also want to invite the different participants that are with us today to turn off the microphones when you're not speaking, and we also want to let you know that this event is being done in both English and Spanish. By this, we mean that there is live interpretation to English, which you can access in the interpretation module in the lower part of your screen. And with this, we want to invite you to choose the language of your preference. In a similar manner, whoever wants to ask a question to those that are with us today, you can make use of it through the chat that is dedicated to this tool. The seminar is being recorded and it shall be uploaded to our YouTube channel in the original format as well as in the English version. And so let's take another look at if we have received any sort of participation on behalf of the public through means of the question platform. With the QR code that was on screen, or entering Mindy.com and seeking the 2699504 code. Very well. I believe there's a bit of lag input when it comes to the results for the question. We're going to allow for a little bit more of time so that the question can be answered. at menti.com. And in the case that we wouldn't be able to show the results as of now, then we'll continue with our normal schedule and we'll share the results later on. Very well, let's continue with the program. I believe we have some answers already. We have 9 negative answers and 20 affirmative answers. The question is, have you ever found yourself in a violent situation that is gender-based within your institution? And there were 20 answers that claimed yes, 9 that claimed no. Thank you very much to all of those who shared your opinion. And further down the line, we will share another question so that you can also share that within the framework of today's event. And so we, continuing with our schedule, are going to begin with today's event with some words from the director of UNESCO IESALC, Francesc Pedró. Dr. Pedró, the floor is yours. Please go ahead. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today for numerous reasons. The first one is because when I became the director of the Institute about 3 years ago, one of the first things that we saw and did was to open up with a tradition in which each International Women's Day, our institute would provide a small piece of support by showing what is the current status of the situation, specifically for higher education. And truth be told, it's been like this for 3 years, more or less. Things have changed. Most likely, a lot of people will say that there is not change at the speed that they would like, but things have been advancing fairly quickly. I remember the initial data that was presented regarding the status of women in the region, and basically, those indicators are still perfectly valid nowadays, even though there may be different situations, but still, this of course shows that women are the dominant gender when it comes to university classrooms. In addition, we have data from different reports that show that women, by comparison to men, obtain better qualifications and they graduate before as well. Basically, from this point of view, strictly from educative efficiency, women have an advantage, so much so that in numerous regions, the concern regarding what is going on with men is coming up. What happens with young men who maybe do not even end up finishing their programs or degrees in time or get enough positive or good grades? And this leads, of course, to abandonment. But, well, on a more satisfactory note, this, of course, contrasts with the fact that as we begin our university studies from different regions, assistant professors and high professors, the percentage of women is reduced to basically a quarter of what was to be expected. Basically, the more the occupational pyramid, the more you can reduce the presence of women. And it is very difficult for us, of course, to progress in this regard, looking not just at a gender base with our attitude, but also on a basis of power. Is that right? And well, of course, this is good news, but it's also true that yesterday, 4 out of 5 universities, of the most prestigious ones as well, if by prestigious we understand that they are the ones that are mentioned the most or seen the most in rankings and initial positions, 4 of those 5 starting June, there will be women leaders, women rectors as well. And I think that this is good news. But again, this is just the context of what needs to concern us, which is how we can manage to translate that female advantage in the classroom to what would be an actual adequate coexistence within authority and power in the academic sector. And I believe that we're advancing. But today's topic is a topic that is overall positive, because even though we are linked on a gender basis, and specifically with women's situations in higher education, this is truly a topic in which basically what has been done for years is to cover up the existence of these conflicts that are truly concerning and that have enormous implications, not just for the lives of those who have been directly afflicted, but in general for those who have a sense of community and who want to characterize all these different higher education afflictions. That is why today we have decided to dedicate numerous efforts for gender-based violence, specifically against women, including their exclusion from higher education. For some participants that are present at this webinar, maybe this is something that doesn't sound as positive. It is as if avoiding the use of the term violence goes against us, thinking that it doesn't exist, but should be told. And as will be seen by our colleague Daniela, it is a fact, and it is a fact that is paradoxic in nature, because higher education institutions are above and beyond spaces for tranquility, in which the rights of people, regardless of their orientation and gender must be respected. So if this is not happening at higher education institutions, then what will happen within the rest of society? Unfortunately, the paradox is that violence against women is not related just with the social economic status of people, but on the contrary, sometimes those variables that explain the differences amongst people never explain the existence of violence in a context in which economic income can be increasingly high, especially when we look at higher education. Regardless, we find ourselves in situations that are despicable regarding violence against women. And in this regard, today, we would like to open up a perspective so that we can share with you some different preliminary advancements that we've had within this regard that must always end up not just with an analysis of what is going on, in this case, increasing, so to speak, the carpet so we can see what is below, but to also try and answer questions by stating, okay, so what do we do, or what should be done by institutions and governments afterward? And I'd love to get to know how all different participants can share different points of view, opinions, and otherwise for those all that are present. Once again, thank you very, very much. I hope we have a very nice discussion regarding this topic that is so positive, so great, but at the same time, so viral. Thank you very much once again. Thank you very much, Director, for your words and introductory speech for this topic that is so very interesting, which is now going to be presented before the audience with Daniele Vieira. And so allow me to introduce Daniele Vieira, who is a joint professor of the University of Pernambuco in Brazil at the Social Science Center. He's going to show the preliminary results of this pilot survey launched in November. Professor Vieira has been a main analyst when it comes to policies at international policies at UNESCO for higher education, and specialized in different programs at the Institute for Permanent Learning. She is also a professor at Hamburg, Germany, and she's been invited by the University of California and Santa Barbara, United States. Now, she also used to work with the Germany Institute for Development and the Secretariat of the United Nations for Climate Change. Professor Vieira, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the introduction. I would like to excuse myself because I will be speaking in English, but I think we will have translation to Spanish. Could you just confirm, Sarah, that is the case? Okay. I'm going to share my screen now with the presentation. And then, Sarah, can you please confirm that you can hear me well and also that you can see the presentation?
Yes, Daniele.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. I would like to greet the other speakers and members of the webinar, as well as the audience who is joining us today. Happy International Women's Day to everybody. I will do a small presentation here, a short presentation about the topic of violence against women, based on a pilot survey that we did with some higher education institutions in the Latin America and the Caribbean. So it's very important that I highlight from the beginning of the presentation that we don't intend here to be very descriptive in terms of the data that we have. The data that we have is only exploratory. So our initial idea with the pilot survey was to have some initial insights and understanding of what the issue of violence against women is in the region. And then based on that, we can have a more concrete and detailed global survey that can be done within the next months, including all the other UNESCO regions. So it's important that that we highlight here that we are still on a very exploratory phase of the research, of the survey, but I think the data that we have here is already good data for us to understand, have some initial insights on the issue that we want to understand. So to start the presentation, I just want to first to say what exactly is violence against women, for us to understand and also for us to be on the same page. Do we understand what violence against women is, not only inside the higher education institutions, but in general? What exactly is violence against women? And it's important that we say that violence against women is a universal phenomenon. I will present here some data for the Latin American and the Caribbean region, but the problem or the issue does not only occur in our region. It's a universal phenomenon that occurs in other regions, in various spaces, including also the higher education institutions. According to UN Women, violence against women is a human rights violation. And it comes, for example, from aspects of gender inequality, discrimination, some cultural or social norms, for example, which are unfavorable to women, which still persist in our society. So it's important that we say that we are talking about a violation against human rights in general. And in addition to that, it's also nice to say that the WHO has included violence against women among their portfolio, for example, of public health issues. So since 2021, VAL has also been increasingly recognized as a public health because it affects the health of women in different settings and professional scenarios. Violence against women is also based on some inequalities of power, and we can see that well in our data when we look into the universities and the institutions that we analyze. So we have inequalities of power, for example, that intersect with other dimensions, which are, for example, race, ethnicity, age, disability. So these other dimensions also have an impact on how the women perceive and how they experience the issue of violence inside these institutions. And this issue manifests, of course, in different forms. When we think about violence, often we might think that violence is only physical violence, but that is not the case. It goes beyond physical violence and sexual harassment. We are also talking about, for instance, psychological or emotional violence. That means violence overall in all its forms. And just to finalize this small introduction, we also wanted to highlight that the topic of violence against women is increasingly being recognized in society. But when we look, for example, to the university sets, to the higher education settings, what we see is that there is a recent global attention being brought to the topic, particularly because of what the situations that we are experiencing inside the university campuses, for example. So situations related, for example, to the frequency of offensive acts, some contextual variables like the ones I just mentioned in terms of race, ethnicity, age, some certain groups that might suffer violence more than other groups. The gender composition of the work groups, our director has just mentioned the aspect of the rectors inside the top 5 global universities. So what is the gender composition in these work groups, in these high leadership positions? So of course, this also has an influence. We are going to see that soon with the data. Some other background characteristics. So the topic now is being more discussed inside the university setting. And based on that, based on that, what exactly we wanted to understand with the survey. So there are a couple of elements that we would like to understand when we decided to do this research. For example, what are the antecedents for the violence? What are the factors associated with it? What are the factors that lead to the violence inside the institutions? Are there any outcomes? What are the outcomes or the consequences for the females? For example, health consequences, educational consequences, for example, if they have to leave the institutions, economic consequences, which groups are most affected? We did the survey now, the pilot survey now with staff and also students, but which groups are most affected? For example, in terms of age, in terms of subject, in terms of if they are students or staff. So this is also interesting that we would like to understand in more detail next phases of the research. If there are any barriers, for example, for the females to have access to services or elements, strategies that can help them fight the problem inside the institutions. If there are any tools, any instruments, for example, they are being developed by the institutions to reduce the problem, or if they have any measures to prevent the problem, the data that we have about the topic. So in general terms, these are the main aspects that we want to understand with the survey. And for now, we did, as I said, an initial pilot survey to have an initial understanding of the situation, and also to see what are the mechanisms that the institutions have from the perspective, of course, of the respondents, of the females, to address the issue, right? If the higher education institutions, they have some sort of prevention mechanisms or responding mechanisms to all forms of violence that occurs in their institutions. And also based on the survey, we plan to do, as I said, other phases of the survey, globally speaking, to help the institutions to develop some guidelines and recommendations to address the problem, not only to address the problem, but also to prevent the problem. So we did this pilot data collection, which was disseminated across students and staff in the institutions in our region, with respondents who self-identified themselves as women. We received 131 valid responses. And what we did was we disseminated a list of indicators according to each form of the violence, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And we presented them with a list of indicators which details the experience, the actions, the statements, for example, related to violence against women inside the institutions. And then the respondents, they could answer according to their feelings and perceptions as per the indicators that we have shared with them. So I just want to start now looking more specifically in the data that we have with some key takeaways that we have. So before I show the data in detail, I think it's important that from the beginning we have this overview of some of the key takeaways. And the first important one to say is that psychological and emotional violence was the form of violence that was among the respondents that we had experienced at highest rates. So here we are talking about hostility, we are talking about mocking, we are talking about insults. So according to the respondents, this was the type of violence that they experienced the most. We have also seen physical violence inside our sample, but it was reported at lower rates, which we think it's a positive aspect of the survey. Sexual harassment was also reported at significant rates, particularly in terms of verbal and non-physical nature conducts, which are not appropriate. And also the prevention and response mechanisms. As I said in the beginning, we want also to understand if there are any mechanisms inside the institutions to prevent the problem or to respond to the problem once it happens. And overall, the respondents from the pilot survey have reported that, and they reported with high rates, is important to say, that there is a lack of reporting mechanisms, for example, or an awareness and a knowledge inside the institution. So that means that for many of the respondents, the academic community, they simply don't know exactly what it means, violence against women, what are the types of violence. So they have difficulties to have an awareness of what the problem, because they don't really understand what the problem is about. Also, the reporting mechanisms, they have also reported that this is lacking in some of the institutions. So in the end, they said, okay, we recognize there is an urgency that we establish this prevention and some strategies inside the institutions to deal with the problem. So these are the main takeaways of the pilot survey that we would like to share in the beginning. And then just for you to have an idea of the respondents' profile. So here you can see the countries that have responded to the survey. We received quite, for this sample that we had, questions from Mexico, Costa Rica, Argentina, Paraguay. And then when we look here on the right of the slide, you can see that most of the answers that we received are from respondents who belong in the age group of 50 to 60 years old, which is also informs us a little bit about the differences between students and staff inside the institutions. Of course, we had answers from other age groups, but the majority of our answers came from the 50 to the 60-year-old group inside our sample. So let's first look into the psychological and emotional violence, what exactly the respondents, they said about it. And then the first important thing to say is that the majority of the respondents, they have reported that they have experienced psychological or emotional violence inside the institutions. And as I said, we have here a couple of quite few indicators that we have shared with them, and they could choose if they agree, if they disagree, or if they strongly agree or strongly disagree with those elements. So you can see here that we have dimensions. For example, I have felt stressed or anxious about my colleagues when it comes to my physical appearance. Someone has made me feel less capable or suggested that I'm less capable because of my gender. Someone has insulted me. I have considered not attending or dropping out of the institution because of some distressing situation. Someone has tried to repress or humiliate me systematically inside the institution for longer periods. I have felt degraded by other colleagues. I have been inappropriately approached by someone inside the institutions. So what you can see here in these darker colors are the one who, the respondents who strongly agree with these elements inside psychological and emotional violence too. So to highlight here some of the answers that have caught our attention when we look into the emotional violence, here you can see some of the dimensions that were reinforced by the respondents as strongly agreed. So this means, for example, that here you can see that 26% of the respondents strongly agree that they have experienced emotional violence, or that they have perceived colleagues or professors' hostility toward women. 15%, for example, have strongly agreed that they fear retaliation if they report an incident of violence. Or 22%, for example, have said that they feel offended, they have been offended or degraded by men in experiences of emotional violence inside the institution. And 29% strongly agree that they trust the institution to believe them if they believe and protect them if they report such kind of violence inside the institution, which is a positive data. So a significant number of respondents have said, okay, I believe that the institution will believe me and protect me if I need to report some sort of violence, emotional violence that I have suffered. So this was the first element that we have analyzed. We have also analyzed the aspect of physical violence inside the institutions, and similar to the emotional violence here, we have a couple of dimensions that we have shared with them, as you can see on the slide, and similar to the emotional violence, they had here to choose if they agree or not, if they have experienced that or not inside the institutions. And the important thing to say here, and this is something that we want to further analyze when we go really into collecting the data more globally, is that although direct exposure to physical violence was reported with low rates, so when we see here, for example, I have experienced physical violence at my institution, and 80% of them disagreed with that. So there is a low rate of exposure to physical violence. Although that is the case, and this is something positive, we have many respondents that have confirmed that they have witnessed other women being hit or held firmly against their will on campus. So one of preliminary interpretation that we have of that is that there might be an underestimation here. So they didn't directly suffer that, but they confirmed that they have witnessed other women being having physical violence. So we think that this is a data that we should look into more detail. There might be an underestimation here. But again, these are the elements here that we have shared with in the survey. So I feel safe around my male colleagues. I have felt physically unsafe on campus. The campus becomes unsafe at irregular schedules. This is something interesting to see. So for example, classes after office hours, during weekends, for example, I know whom to contact at my institution if I've been physically attacked. 21% strongly agree with that. Someone has physically stopped me from leaving, for example. The vast majority said no. Some men invade my personal space. So we have 19% which have agreed with that. So as I said, these are, as we have a limitation of time here, we don't really have time to go into all the elements. So I think by the slide here, you can have an idea of what are the dimensions and exactly how they have reported on that. But also here, we would like to highlight some of these answers in terms of the physical violence. And here we highlight those dimensions where the respondents have said that they strongly agreed. So for example, I know who to contact at my institution if I feel physically attacked. 30% have agreed with that, which is good. The institutions might not have institutionalized mechanisms to prevent the problem, but this somehow shows us that at least they know how someone to contact, or a department or a center inside the institutions to contact in case they have this kind of problems. I feel safe around my male classmates. We also have a good report on that. Physical violence is likely preceded by psychological violence. 18% have reported that they strongly agree with that. This is also a data interesting for us that we think we should look into more detail. So if psychological violence precedes physical violence, so maybe we should start tackling psychological violence, so emotional violence first. And maybe some females and also the institutions, as we saw in the beginning of my presentation, are not even aware of all these kinds of violence. So this is also an important element that we wanted to highlight here. 14% have strongly agreed that the campus becomes unsafe at irregular schedules, and also a significant number here that they consider that they feel uncomfortable, for example, or unsafe with men, for example, getting too close, touching their belongings without consent. So this is some of the data about physical violence that we would like to share with you for now for the pilot survey. Sexual harassment has also been investigated by the pilot survey. And in terms of sexual harassment, from the respondents, we got conducts of verbal nature, for example, so inappropriate words or vocabulary were the most reported experiences by the respondents, together with some other elements that you can see here in the graphic. So we have asked them, have you ever experienced any of the following at your university? And although we can see the majority have answered no, we still have high rates of females respondents that have reported yes. So for example, 45% have said that they have experienced insulting language, for example, or seeing other women being suffering rude behavior or insulting language inside the institutions. 36% of the respondents, for example, said that they have experienced sex-related comments about the physical characteristics inside the institutions. 27% have experienced unnecessary physical contact, for example, including unwanted touching. 36% have experienced being told sexual jokes. So, of course, the majority reported that they haven't experienced, that they did not experience, But the ones who have experience, who answered yes to this aspect of the survey was also high. So we also think that this is something that deserves further attention. And here you can see, okay, based on that, on the previous questions that we made, which factors do you think the most increase the risk of sexual violence? So what are the factors that you think that can increase women suffering such type of violence? And then when they were asking about this, they included, for example, the increased risk of poor capacity, for example, to respond to the problem inside the institutions, the existence of the gender roles or stereotypes, which still prevails, which still persists inside the institutions. So you can see also here some of the elements that we have, that they have reported, for example. So the majority said, okay, we don't really have a knowledge on how to report to sexual violence. And it's important that the audience understands this. Here, we're only asking about the type of sexual violence. We are not asking about the other elements. We know the sexual violence is a little bit more, is a bigger issue compared to the other violence for various reasons. And one of them is that some females might not feel comfortable to talk about this kind of violence. So that's why they say, okay, we don't know how to report about the problem. We see that there are weak sanctions inside the institutions, society which is still understand this hyper-masculine behavior, something correct, the societal norms, which still reinforce the women's stereotypes, the lack of sexual education inside the institutions, or the support to women regarding sexual violence. So you can see also here in this slide that these were the factors that they reported as being the most important factors which increase the risk of them suffering sexual violence inside the institutions. And to finalize, we had the other type of violence that we have included in the survey, which is the institutional violence. For example, when asked about what contributed to the risk of violence against women inside the institutions, we wanted to understand, okay, are there any elements which belongs to the institution which interfere, for example, in the violence they suffer? And then most of the respondents, they have mentioned the low levels of prevention. So there are not many prevention mechanisms inside the institutions. The absence of an effective response system, for example, inside the institutions, and the gender inequality, which is related to what I said in the beginning of my presentation. So the more we go to leadership positions, for example, we see less women. So this gender inequality is also part of this institutional violence, the lack of mechanisms inside the institution to prevent the problem. So, for example, here on the right, you can see there is a lack of women representation in decision-making. So 28% of the respondents confirmed, strongly agree with that. Or the absence of a university policy, for example, to respond to the problem. Or the disconnection between the national laws and the university policies. Or even the absence of a university policy to respond to the problem. Or priority to protect the institution's reputation. 22%, I'm sorry, have reported that they agree with that. So I know I have a limitation of time, I will stop by here, but you can see here that there are several dimensions also that we think are quite interesting and that deserve further attention, further responses. So we can have a clear picture of how exactly this happens in practice. Lack of gender programs, lack of on-campus facilities, or care centers, poor reporting mechanisms, lack of staff training. So these were all the dimensions that have been reported by the respondents as part of the institutional violence. That means these are the elements that contribute to their risk of suffering violence against women inside their institutions. And to finalize, we asked them, okay, based on that, which strategies you think are necessary inside the institution so then we can prevent or respond to the problem. In the presentation, I showed here 4 different types of violence that can happen to women inside those institutions. And based on that, which are the strategies that the institutions can put into practice to avoid the problem. And then here what we see is that the vast majority of the respondents on the sample that we have, it's important to highlight that, the women have fully recognized, the vast majority have fully recognized the importance to establish these interventions, not only to respond to the problem, but also to prevent the problem. And here we have a couple of strategies that we have shared with them, and the vast majority have agreed with that. So, for example, to create a dedicated committee inside the institutions to deal with the problem, to have some programs to support women inside the institutions, to work together with the government agencies to connect the policies inside the institutions with the national policies, engage with activities outside the institutions which deal with the problem, implement, for example, a strategic plan inside the institution to deal with the problem, develop, for example, a periodic evaluations, and this is also something that somehow we are doing here, like collecting the survey, and this is also something that can be done on a regular basis. So as you can see here, there are a couple of strategies that have been mentioned, and then the vast majority of the respondents, they agreed with that, the importance that we start establishing those strategies as soon as possible. So they say, okay, the vast majority said, okay, we think that these strategies would make a significant difference to deal with the problem. And then I finalize my presentation here with some final insights from this pilot survey. I would like to highlight, reinforce once again that we had a small sample, and this was just very, very exploratory phase of the research for us to have an initial idea. And then despite this small sample, we think that we could already perceive here some critical insights in the context of the higher education institutions. So we saw, for example, based on the data, that the emotional psychological violence was reported in high levels, that on the other hand, physical violence was reported in lower rates. Conduct of verbal nature was also reported as part of the sexual harassment that the respondents, they experience. They think that many levels, for example, many indicators inside the institutions are lacking to protect them against the problem, including, for example, the low levels of preventions. And then the respondents, they think that this can contribute to the risk of violence against women inside the institution. And then the vast majority of the respondents, they have recognized the necessity that we establish some clear interventions, both for response and also for prevention of the problem. So I will stop my presentation here, Sarah. I would like to say thank you very much for everyone who have joined us, and then thank you for your attention. And let me just stop my presentation and go back to the room. Thank you so much.
Thank you much, Daniele, for this very important amount of info filled with different challenges, which are going to be discussed and analyzed through our panel, moderated by our director. But before we move on to the panel, the questions that we want to make sure that the audience can answer, well, there's a question that's already been shown here. We can see it in the chat. We'll see the results here, and we'll look at the answers later on. We're very interested in your opinion and participation. And we would allow me to introduce our guest to the seminar online. We have Professor Miriam Alpízar, which is the Chief of the Secretariat of the Ministry of Higher Education for Cuba. We also have the Commission of Gender for Higher Education, created through presidential decrees. She is a doctor in education sciences from the University of La Habana, as well as economy, author of over 45 scientific different articles. And here, she's also earned different scientific investigation awards, specifically in 2018, as well as an investigator when it comes to university management, doctor, analyzer, and supporter of economy and sciences and education, vice president of the Council of Government back in September 2022. We're also accompanying us is Professor Altagracia López Ferreiras from different female leader groups as well as institutions for the formations of female magistrates. She's investigator and professor of the Santo Domingo Technical Institution, where she was rector and where she also leads the investigation center. Her initial education is in math. She has a master's degree in planning for higher education and a PhD in education. She has voluntary work done at the Sembradores, and she works with different children that are under malnutrition, as well as elderly population that are under vulnerable situations. And we also have Valentina Caballero, doctor for the Arizona State University, who has studies done in English literature, done in the University of Paraguay, and a master's degree from State University of San Diego. She's director of the Language Center Institution, where she leads investigation categorized within the national program for incentives for investigators, editor of scientific magazines, as well as Multilingua and Society and Education for Paraguayan teaching virtually, and she's also a part of a council for UNESCO. She's currently the leader of the Aula Vías program. She has gone through numerous higher education institutions through financing of the European Union to improve teacher and learning procedures. Thank you to all of our panelists today, and thank you very much to Dr. Pedró as well, who will be the moderator of this conversation, for being with us within this part of the agenda. Thank you very much, and Pedro, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. I would like to start by highlighting the data that Daniele has shared with us, which I believe is truly the correct expression would be they are shocking. Truth be told, I believe we've done positive work in moving on everything under the rug, basically, because as the data points to, we can see positive input, of course, but there's also negative ones as well. And these results are heartbreaking in more than one sense. We have a very broad amount of questions for these different panelists that are gathered here today. And maybe I would like to start by reminding you, of course, that any comment or statement that you want to make, especially with the data that Danielle just shared, is more than welcome. I, on my behalf, would also like to remind you that within this small survey that was done, along with the 100 people that are taking part in this event, we've seen that two-thirds, right? Two-thirds state that they have been or have witnessed or taken part somehow in gender-based violence. That is very concerning. And in addition, we've also seen the profile of, we've seen this through names. We've seen this through people that are with us this morning. And there's also a second piece of data that's very concerning. It's that only 15% of participants are not women, right? We see that you have male names. This is truly concerning once again, because as we know, Daniele stated at the beginning, this is a day to congratulate all women, of course, but we should also come together, shouldn't we? It's important that we do this for gender-based against. And if that doesn't work, then gender equality is something that must be achieved, and it should be concerning for all of us. Hopefully next year we'll have a greater presence with gender-based in this regard. Up until here, I could advance, and I would like to advance with a series of questions for the panelists. First of all, I would like to thank all of them for being here, and those two questions have a lot to do with the order. If you allow me, I'm going to change the order so that we can have a sort of internal logic. The first one is, from your point of view, how do you see the implications that gender-based violence can be seen within university-based context. And I'm not talking just about tragic consequences that may come up in which people may become victims, but in general terms or in broad terms, what does the existence of this gender-based violence tell us in regard to situations for our universities, for example, for equity, gender, and of course, promoting peace? These are different values that are present. I would like for you to please give us your point of view, and then provide on a second round, we'll see what do you think about this? What is being seen within higher education institutions, and what do you think could be implemented to make things better? We're going to follow the same order, if you agree with that. And so, first of all, I shall pass the floor to Dr. Miriam Alpízar so that she can share her points of view in regard to what she believes are truly the implications, and definitively, why should we be concerned with these topics more than in other social contexts? But again, the floor is yours, ma'am. Well, greetings to all. Once again, this is an opportunity for us to celebrate International Women's Day, which has been celebrated for over a century at this point, that we be gathered here at this webinar for United Nations, for Latin America, for the Caribbean. That is something that truly fills me with pride and happiness. I was paying attention to the results of the survey, and I also was listening to the words of our director as well. And well, you think faster maybe than what is being shown. And we see a current topic that we see that it's a country where 50% of women, or more than 50% of women, are principals or rectors throughout the different universities. Cuba is a country where 62% of students at universities are women as well. Regardless, it's been about 10 or 15 years of investigations at this point in which we look at gender-based violence, and this ended up being with a decree that was issued in 2021 over a new program regarding women's role in Cuba. Again, looking at a gender-based violence perspective and a family perspective. Now, in this regard, it's been constituted within the organization in each of the sectors, and we've been looking at different gender-based committees that, again, are present in higher education, accompanied by a group of women and men as well, that are very valuable investigators in this regard. And so, by specifying higher education, it is very important, very, very important overall, because within higher education, we are forming, of course, professionals that are going to transform the future, that are bidding on sustainable development, and that even now, from elementary or primary education, we know that from then onward, there must be a process where we treat gender and violent situations. And of course, higher education within professionals in a very specific manner, looking at all different social studies and humanitarian studies, where we see investigators and researchers, they must be the ones that can add on to a culture in our society. It's our mission to transform society. And this is something that is implicit in gender-based violent topics. The thing is that they're not visible enough. We have not been able to see that there is an affliction on gender on a psychological or emotional level that can show all of these results, excluding, of course, each of our countries, because it depends on public policies. We require public policies that should or would introduce all these different concepts regarding the struggle against our institutions, against the government, against gender-based violence. So first of all, when we look at higher education, we require that they make visible all the issues that are incorporated to training and teaching, because it's not just the teachers, it's all the workers, it's all those who work within a service area. And overall, where there are so many youngsters and so many people that come from a gender basis or background that not have to do just with gender itself, but also with educational profiles and gender base, that respect to diversity must also be part of our youth. And well, our teachers also play a very important role as well. That's why I stated the importance of making sure that that instrument, that tool be applied, and it's very important that we use it as well. I don't like to see that there's little representation, for example, for Cuba. I saw 2 responses only with those tools. I believe it's an opportunity for us to apply it as well, and I believe that we cannot say it doesn't exist, that gender-based violence is non-existent, even though it might not come up specifically when we look at different positions, rankings, that it's not openly transparent. But we also believe that it has to do with one another, and the fear, of course, of stating this. Women do not speak freely about this, and this is something that does not happen when it comes to psychological violence with what is going on within families, because we see this in all contexts, including the workplace. I believe that is our opinion, and thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, doctora Alpízar. Ha puesto el dedo en la llaga cuando se ha referido insistentemente a la necesidad de visibilizar un fenómeno que probablemente está ahí, ¿verdad? Pero que no conseguimos que aflore, ¿no? Y desde luego pondremos a su disposición los instrumentos que hemos generado para que, lógicamente, sean utilizados, ¿no? Pero realmente es interesante darse cuenta de que en general, la cuestión de la violencia de género tiene que verse desde una perspectiva también mucho más amplia y tal vez me estoy avanzando, ¿no? Que en los próximos años intentaremos también que nuestro trabajo en materia de género en educación superior identifique no solo la diatriba entre mujeres y hombres, sino que tenga una perspectiva también mucho más amplia de derecho de
a bigger
derechos de
perspective
diversidad sexual,
in
¿no? Pero
terms
en
of
cualquier
sexual
caso, en el
diversity.
tema que nos ocupa hoy, ciertamente la
Violence
violencia
is
es preocupante y es
really
muy preocupante
worrying
que la tengamos también en las instituciones de educación superior.
in
Muchas
higher
gracias.
education
Le cedo ahora la
institutions.
palabra a la
Altagracia
profesora
López is
Altagracia
now
López,
next.
que también, digamos,
She's
cercana
close to
geográficamente
Cuba
a Cuba, pero estoy
geographically, and I'm
segura
sure
que
that
también con una perspectiva también
she can
muy,
bring a great
muy
perspective
interesante para
to
todos
all of
nosotros.
us. Professor
Profesora López tiene
Lopez,
la palabra.
you have the word, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Dr. Pedro,
Dr.
for
Pedró, por
this
esta
opportunity
oportunidad
for
de
dialogue.
diálogo.
And
Y
I would like
quisiera
to start by
iniciar
thanking
agradeciendo al IESAL UNESCO que
UNESCO
dentro de sus
in their
acciones
within their
otorga
actions.
especial
She gives
prioridad a convocarnos
us
en diferentes momentos
visibility and
para debatir problemas que
brings us
impactan
together to
la
talk about problems
desigualdad
that impact
de género a
gender
nivel de la
equity in
educación
higher
superior.
education.
Y siempre hacerlo
And it's always
con una
important to do it
mirada
keeping our
puesta
eyes in
en
promoting
la
equality,
igualdad
gender
de género
equality within a
en un
context
contexto de
of
una
a
vida
good quality
buena
of life
en
within
la
society
sociedad
and a
y de un
bigger
mayor
empowerment for women
empoderamiento de la mujer también a nivel
in
de
terms
la
of higher
educación
education.
superior. Y bueno,
And
ya que
since
tengo la
I have the
palabra,
floor,
quisiera también agradecer
I like to
las
thank all the
pioneras
pioneers in this
en este
topic,
tema,
those
a las
women who
mujeres
opened the
que
pathway
abrieron camino
and paved the
para que
pathway
hoy
for us to
podamos
be able to
ocupar
occupy positions
posiciones
of
de
leadership,
liderazgo también,
for us
para que
to
podamos en la
be able to
sociedad
debate
debatir
openly
francamente
these
estos
topics, but
temas, pero
also
también para
to
buscar y
seek and
luchar para que
struggle
impere la
for
igualdad y la equidad,
equality,
no solo en las instituciones de educación superior,
not
sino
just in higher
también
education
en la
institutions, but also
sociedad.
in society.
Y a
And to
su
answer your question
pregunta
as
de
to
por qué
why should we
debemos
worry
preocuparnos las
in higher education
instituciones de educación superior por
institutions for
este
this
tema.
topic,
Bueno, primeramente
well, first of all,
porque
because
las
institutions of
instituciones
higher
de educación
education
superior
as
como
space
espacio de formación en lo
for
superior, no
higher
debemos
education,
estar
we shouldn't
ajenas
be strangers to what happens in the internal surroundings, but also in the external surroundings. And the numbers that we are presented with today and that we from the country, compiled from the country, we can see news of violence against women, tells us that we should really keep this physical violence in mind, and we should attend to it, which happens in higher education institutions, and we have clear normatives as to what happens with physical violence. But the other one that Daniel was presenting to us, which is psychological violence, harassment, sexual harassment, which particularly in Dominican Republic, sexual harassment is not seen or perceived as violence, and also street harassment. When people go out to walk, they can't because they find people who are following them and they feel unsafe when walking alone. So we need an environment that nurtures peace, and for us to evolve in peace in the different sceneries where we interact. And yes, it's true that violence that is seen within universities, and Daniel verified it in his investigation, it's psychological violence. This is a type of violence that is not physically observed. Therefore, it leaves internal marks within a person. So universities have to pay close attention to violence, first and foremost, because a bigger number of students are women. If women suffer psychological violence, it's fair that institutions pay attention to this and develop mechanisms to face this type of violence. Maybe we can talk more than mitigation instruments, but also generating a culture that constructs peace, a culture that constructs equality on behalf of human rights. And this violence that is seen in higher education, and that many times happens amongst the students themselves. It's also it also makes a parallel between victimizer and victim. It's about the empowerment of one over the other, or the power that one over the other has. So universities have to pay close attention to violence itself, but also to the consequences of gender violence and what it generates. We saw in the investigation how this violence brings results of self-esteem deterioration, self-questioning, self-worth. Am I doing this right? Am I to blame for it? And also shame, that feeling that I don't want people to know, depression, anxiety, different disorders in terms of sleeping and eating habits that women go through, especially going to extreme cases, trauma abuse of substance abuse, which are
nocivas para la salud,
harmful for
o
health, and
tendencias al
also
suicidio,
suicide,
y cómo
and how we
nosotros no
shouldn't
debemos
be
estar ajenos
strangers in
en la
higher
educación
education
superior
to this
a
type of
este tipo
phenomena,
de fenómenos
which
que están
which is happening
aconteciendo
in
en
our
nuestro
surroundings.
interior.
And
Y
also,
también
it's
es
important that
importante que
we know
sepamos las
the
consecuencias
consequences that
que
this
esta
psychological
violencia
violence
psicológica
has
tiene en el rendimiento
on
académico
academic
del estudiantado. Porque,
performance of
bueno,
students,
sienten
because they
pérdida
feel a
de
lack of
interés,
interest.
no hay
They can't
concentración en
concentrate
los
on
estudios
studies
porque lo
because
que hay es
they're
mucha
worrying a lot for the
preocupación por
situation
la
that they're
situación que
going
se está
through.
viviendo,
And
pero
sometimes,
también
in
en
some
algunos
cases,
casos
they
hay
look,
pérdida de
there's a loss of
confianza
trust in the
en lo que les
surroundings, in the
rodea,
environment,
¿no? Ese temor
the
a
fear
que
that
mis
my
compañeros
classmates may
relaten o digan o
tell
cuenten. También hay retiros
people
frecuentes
withdraw from
de
classes,
asignaturas,
particularly
particularmente
in
mi ámbito
in
de
my area of
investigación ha
investigation.
tenido que ver con
I've
la
seen,
deserción, la repitencia y
and
eficiencia de titulación en
it had
educación
an impact
superior dominicana.
in
Y vemos que si
achieving
bien es
the right
cierto
qualifications to
que la mujer
advance.
tiene un
And we
mejor
can see that women
rendimiento,
perform
pero
better, but also
también
when they go through
cuando tienen
situations
situaciones
that affect
que
them
afectan
psychologically,
psicológicamente,
they
pues
withdraw from
retiran
topics or from
asignaturas y en muchos casos se retiran
classes, and
y se
sometimes they
cambian de
withdraw from the
institución o
institution
se
or
retiran
from
de la
higher
educación
education
superior.
altogether.
De manera
So
que
this should
no debe
not be the
sernos
case.
ajeno la problemática que enfrentan el
There
mayor
is a
número
problem that
de
a lot
el
of
estudiantado
students
que
face, and
está en nuestros
they belong
recintos
to our universities.
universitarios. Y por qué no,
So we
debemos
should
seguir
dig deeper
profundizando
into
en
investigation
investigaciones
as
como la
the
que hoy
one
se
we're seeing
presenta
today,
para
for
nosotros
us to
también tener
have information
información
and to
y
be
poder
able to
hacer, digamos, buscar
seek
alternativas de
alternatives and
solución en
solutions
base a la
based on
información que
the
estamos
information that we
recopilando
have compiled
de
from our
nuestra
institutions
institución y de
and from our
nuestro sistema de
education
educación
system in higher
superior.
education.
Particularmente yo tengo, digamos,
Particularly, I have a
algunas
couple of
preocupaciones
concerns, a
porque
few
como
concerns
sistema
as
de
a
educación
higher education
superior,
system.
este es un
This is a
tema que
topic
no
that
lo
we don't
tocamos
talk enough
y
about,
deberíamos
and we should
investigar
investigate
sobre qué
as to what
pasa con
happens
la
with
violencia
violence
de la
against
mujer
women
en la
in higher
educación
education
superior
in Dominican
dominicana.
Republic.
Si bien es
We
cierto
know
que los
that
centros
it's
de
true that the
estudios de
Centers for
género
Gender Study, they
juegan
play an
un papel
important, fundamental
fundamental
role in the
en la
region, in the
región, en el
country,
país,
but
no menos
it's not
cierto es que
untrue that
seguimos
we still
teniendo ausencia
have
de estudios y
a
de
lack of
propuestas.
studies and proposals.
Aprovecho la
I
ocasión
want to
para
take advantage of
compartir con ustedes y que lo pueden
sharing
encontrar
this with
en
you.
la
You can
página
find this
web
in the webpage
del
in the
Instituto
Technological
Tecnológico de
Institute of
Santo
Santo
Domingo.
Domingo.
Es que ayer
Yesterday,
el
the
Centro de
Technological Gender
Estudios del Género de INTEC
Study Center
lanzó un
released a
documento,
document
¿no?
where
Que
they
lo que
promoted
promueve es
the
educar en la
education of
igualdad
equality.
y es un poco develando los desafíos que esta situación nos presenta, pero también planteando propuestas para la educación preuniversitaria. En República Dominicana, la educación preuniversitaria abarca preescolar, educación
Basic
básica
education
y educación
and
media.
preschool education and mid education.
Les dejo
I
la
now hand
palabra
Dr.
Dr.
Pedro over again,
podría aportar
and
sobre
he can
cualquier
share
otra inquietud
any
que
other
usted
questions that
tenga.
he may have. Thank you very
Muchísimas
much,
gracias,
Professor
profesora
Lopez.
López. Es siempre un
It's
placer
always a pleasure to
escucharla
hear
porque
you,
tiene una
to
mentalidad
listen to you.
como muy,
You
yo
have a
diría,
great
nos ayuda a todos
mindset
a
that
organizar el
allows us
pensamiento. Yo
to
creo que eso debe tener
organize
que ver con su formación
our trains of
matemática,
thought.
probablemente, ¿no? Pero me ha parecido muy claro
It's
y desde
clear
luego, a la medida que iba
that
hablando,
as you
recordaba
were
que hay
talking,
muchos lugares,
there were many places,
incluyendo
including
universidades,
universities,
en las que nada más
where
acceder
as soon as you go in, it says smoke-free space. When you were talking, I thought you were right. We should guarantee. We're talking about gender violence, but the university space should be a space where there is a small space where peace is guaranteed, a place where you don't feel harmed, especially in terms of gender. And that has led me to think I answered the survey at the beginning of the webinar, and I answered I left university in 2005. That was a long time ago, and I don't feel like I have seen ever around me a situation of gender violence. But when I heard you talking, I realized that maybe even our perception, or my own perception of what gender violence is, looking back, I imagine a situation where there's physical violence. This type of violence is more complex. As people have talked in the chat, it has to do with the language we use, with the fact that we have fear, and we face situations of fear. In situations that is not just offensive, but violent. Well, thank you very much for your answer, Dr. Lopez, Professor Lopez. We're moving over to another continent, to Paraguay. Professor Canese, and I think she has a number of points to talk about. She has shared some of them in the chat, but Professor Canese, it's a pleasure to have you here. You have the floor. I just wanted to thank you, first of all, thanks IESALC, as my teammates have said, for giving this space so we can reflect upon what is understood by gender equality, what is understood by violence against women. And I don't want to say that you've said everything, you've said a lot.
Tanto la doctora Alpízar como la doctora López, por ese motivo,
mentioned a lot. So I'm going to just highlight a couple of things that caught my attention about the research that has been shared with us, and also how the implications on higher education with the questions that you posed to answer those questions. I've already shared one of the things that caught my attention. First of all, about 70% have indicated that they don't know whom to contact in terms of campus violence. If there was campus violence, we're talking about safety here. That area that has to do with identifying or preventing and reporting violence, this caught my attention, because it has to do with what Dr. Alpízar said about visualization. What is violence? What is equity? What is equality? Not how many people access university, how many lecturers there are, and the power relation between people in the different areas, and how we can interpret this in light of violence against women, how this is interpreted, how behaviors are interpreted for men and women. It has a little bit to do with what you were talking about, and the topic about psychological and emotional violence, and how what you've just mentioned, Dr. Pedró, how many a times men don't even realize about certain behaviors that can generate a type of violence, whether it's emotional or psychological violence, how against their colleagues and fellow students, female students. Last year we had an incident with a lecturer who told a student that she was too young to be pregnant in a Zoom
porque ella
meeting
compartió
because
que
she
se
shared
había
that
que
she had become
y
pregnant,
bueno, él
and he
pensó que lo
thought
hacía
that
con
he
un
did it with a
espíritu de buena
goodwill
voluntad o
spirit
una cosa de estas por su background, ¿verdad? Por
because of
su
his background, his
experiencia
experience,
o por su, digamos,
and the way he
perspectiva
perceived
de señor
uh,
ya de años, ¿no?
because of his age,
Pero que
and it
tuvo
had
una
a very
repercusión
negative
muy negativa en
repercussion
el ambiente.
in the
Y eso
environment. And
hablamos
we
del
are
mismo otra
talking
vez de la
about
seguridad. ¿Cómo me
safety
siento,
again,
como decía la doctora López,
how we can
crear
create
ambientes donde podamos
environments
estar
where we can
seguros?
feel
Entonces ahí es donde
safe.
también
And this
me
caught
llamó la atención
my
la
attention
respuesta que
when we
hablaba de la
answered about
seguridad en
security
los
in
campus
university campuses
universitarios después de
after
ciertas horas
certain
que en muchos casos se vuelven inseguros
hours they become
y que
unsafe,
muchas veces no
and
sabemos a
sometimes we
dónde
don't know
recurrir.
where to
Entonces eso
go.
se trata de
So
prevención,
it's
se
about
trata de
prevention,
concientización, se trata también de
it's
intervención
awareness,
y
and
de
also
respuesta
response
a
to this
este
type of
tipo de
behaviors.
cosas.
And
Y
one of the
uno de los
indicators that
indicadores que estaba ahí también en ese informe tan interesante,
it's
el
interesting
tema
is
de
the
los motivos por el cual
motives
quizás las
why certain
instituciones
institutions
puedan atender más
or how they're
urgente a
able
este
to
tipo
attend to the
diversos
different
incidentes, ¿no?
gender incidents.
Empezando, y me llamó la atención el
The
ítem que hablaba de,
item
bueno,
that talked about
se
prioritizing
prioriza, digamos, la
the institutional
reputación
reputation
institucional
and putting that
antes
before
que
maybe
quizás
looking
cuidar
after
la
the
seguridad
safety or
o el
security
bienestar
or the well-being of
de las
students.
estudiantes.
It's
Nosotros
sometimes that happens, and
como
I
ya
don't want to
mencionó, no
repeat
quiero
everything
repetir
that
todo
was
lo que
said by
dijo
Professor
la
Lopez
profesora
because
López,
everything
porque
is
todo es
really
valioso.
valuable. But
Nosotros hace poco, justamente el
not
caso de
long
un
ago,
estudiante de nuestra
there was a
universidad
case in our university not
las
so
mujeres
different where women
tienen en la mayoría de
in
las
many of the
facultades
faculties
están
there is a
mayor,
bigger
hay
representation for
mayor
women rather
representación de
than
mujeres que de
over
hombres,
men.
pero
But as it
como
was
bien lo dijeron también las
mentioned
profesoras,
by the
en muchos
professors,
casos
in many of the cases
hay un
there is a
nivel
bigger
mayor de
level of
deserción, sobre
desertion.
todo luego de que las mujeres
Withdrawing from courses,
o se
sometimes they get
casan
married,
o
they
tienen familia,
have
¿no?
families,
Entonces, eso
and
también es
that
una
is a way
forma
of,
de, quizás, no quisiera
I
llamarlo
don't want to say
concretamente de
violence, but
violencia,
the
pero de la invisibilización de la
non-visualization of
problemática de la mujer, que es
problems for women.
problema
That is a problem in itself
en lo que son
in
estas
terms of
cuestiones de
psychological
violencia, quizás
violence
psicológicas
and
y
emotional violence that we can
emocionales que
see.
pudimos ver, donde entonces
Sometimes
quizás
these
no se tienen en cuenta
problems are
las
not taken
problemáticas, las
into
dificultades
account
que puedan tener estudiantes mujeres
where
o
female students
colegas,
or
docentes, funcionarias,
teachers or
por su
workers
condición de mujer, por su
have
condición de
and go
madre,
through because of their
que
condition
muchas
as
veces
women, as
hace
mothers. Sometimes this
que
makes
quizás estén
them
mucho
be
menos
less represented in
representadas en
certain
carreras, en
careers,
algunos
in many
casos,
cases, or
o también en
professional
lugares
fields
de
and
poder, ¿verdad?
areas of
Entonces,
influence,
carreras con más prestigio o carreras
prestigious
donde se tiene
professional
la
fields
salida laboral es mucho más
where
atractiva,
work is attractive.
o
Sometimes
carreras
they're not
tradicionalmente
represented
masculinas, como
in
se conocen
traditionally
en el ámbito
male
de
professional
las STEM,
fields,
sobre
for
todo, por
example,
ejemplo, las carreras de
engineering,
ingeniería, las
IT.
carreras de informática.
We have
Tenemos
very low
representaciones muy bajas de
representation for
mujeres
women, and
y si bien en las ciencias de la
even
salud
though in
sí
in
tenemos
health sciences
mujeres,
we
en
have
las ciencias biológicas
women,
de la salud
there
prácticamente
is
una
an equal
equidad,
representation, but this
eso se
translates later
traduce luego también
to the
en las
opportunities
oportunidades
that
que van
women
teniendo
may
las
have and
mujeres y
the
las
decisions
decisiones
that
que van tomando a
they
lo largo de
take
la carrera. Y
along
eso es una cuestión
their careers.
sistémica de política pública que también que
This
tiene una
has
implicancia en la educación
an
superior,
influence in
ya
higher
que
education.
las mujeres, bueno,
Traditionally,
tradicionalmente, y
it
quizás
shouldn't be this way, but
no
it
debería ser así,
traditionally
pero
women take
asumen el rol,
the
hoy
role.
justamente se estaba hablando de eso en un programa que estaba
We were talking
escuchando de
today
venir
about
a
this
la
topic.
universidad,
They take on the
asumen
role of
el rol
looking
de
after the
cuidado de la
family.
familia. Y eso en muchos casos no hay políticas públicas
In many
que
cases, there are
acompañen a
public
esos roles que
policies
tienen las
that
mujeres y
accompany
que les permita continuar en
that
las carreras que
empowerment
les
to
llevarán
continue
a lugares
women
quizás de más
to
destaque y más relevancia.
places of more
Entonces,
relevance
todo
and
eso se
influence. So all of
traduce
this translates
en
on a
una cuestión de las diferencias que se ven y las cuestiones que tenemos que
all
atender
of this
desde la
let us
universidad, desde
allows
la
us to
educación
see
superior.
what we should focus on
Por
in
eso celebro
higher
ese estudio
education
exploratorio.
institutions, which is why I
Nosotros,
celebrate this
Paraguay
research.
tuvo 16 ICOS que compartimos
Paraguay had
esa
a
encuesta con
survey with a
una
population
población
of
de
about
creo que más de
50,000
50.000
students and
estudiantes y
lecturers.
docentes, etcétera, pero 16 completaron,
60
¿verdad? Vamos a
completed
tratar de
the
hacer
survey.
una
16.
muestra un poco más,
We're going to
o sea,
push
un
this a bit
esfuerzo un poco
more
más grande para tratar
to try and have
de tener
a
una
higher
representación mayor
representation
y ver,
and
bueno,
see
estas
these problems
problemáticas
of
de violencia
violence, which is
quizás
not
que no se ve
perceived a
tanto
lot
o que
and
no se
maybe not even
reporta, porque
reported,
muchas
because
veces no se
many a
sabe,
times
no,
there is a
que
lack of
crean,
knowledge,
la implicancia es la sensación de
presenting a
inseguridad,
feeling of
la sensación
insecurity,
que tienen las mujeres de
that
estar
feeling where
siempre
women are always
inseguras
insecure
en sus
in the
y en sus
different
diversos lugares y que
places
les llevan a, como dijo la
where they
profesora,
evolve, and that
a
makes
apartarse,
them withdraw
a la deserción o a cambiarse de lugar. Y eso es lo que
or
de
move to
alguna
another
manera
place.
se trata este día y
This
se
is what we want
trata
to avoid.
estos
We need to
esfuerzos
make
que tenemos que
efforts
hacer a nivel de
by creating
política
public
pública, a nivel
policy,
institucional.
by
Nosotros
institutional
tenemos
policies. We have
códigos de ética, códigos
ethic
de
codes
conducta,
and
como bien lo
conduct
dijo la
codes of
profesora,
conduct,
por eso se ve
which
menos
is
la
why we
violencia
see
física,
physical
pero
violence less. But
estos
these documents
documentos son
sometimes are
muchas veces
quite
genéricos y
generic,
tratan de todos
and
todos
they
los
talk
tipos de
about
violencia, todos los
overall
tipos
all
de
kinds of
conducta
behaviors,
y
all
no
kinds of
están,
violence,
o
but
sea, y eso va otra vez nuevamente a la
we
visibilidad
go
y
back to
hablaba
the
la
point of
profesora, la doctora Alpízar,
visibility.
que si
If
hacemos
everything is
todo muy genérico,
generic, then
entonces
we
no se
lose
ve lo que es específico
visibility of the
de
specific
ciertas
of certain
poblaciones
populations,
que están
which
en
are at a
mayor
bigger
peligro,
risk,
como en
in
el
many
caso, en
cases,
muchos casos de las
women,
mujeres, ¿verdad? Si bien,
as we
como estaba
said
diciendo,
before in
la educación
higher
superior quizás
education.
para muchos,
Maybe for
para la
the
población
male
masculina, en
population, it
muchos
might
casos
be
quizás
less
sea menos atractiva hoy en
attractive
día,
nowadays,
pero hay
but we
que
need
ver
to
en qué
see what
niveles
educational
educativos
levels
también, o
and
sea, en qué niveles
socioeconomic levels
socioeconómicos. Eso se
is
da en países
seen.
donde hay
Does
mayor
this
equidad o
happen in
no,
countries where
porque
there is
tenemos,
a better economic
hay un montón, la problemática es muy compleja, ¿no?
areas?
La problemática de la equidad sobre todo es compleja, pero
E-
la falta de equidad
Equality is
y las
complex, and the
diferencias en
lack
las
of
relaciones
equality
es lo que hace
in
que
relations is what
se den
makes these
episodios
episodes
o
or
sistemas
violent
violentos
systems
donde no se
visible,
tiene en
where we
cuenta
don't
a los
keep in mind the
derechos
rights of
de los
others.
demás. Y eso es donde es lo que, digamos, tenemos
And
que
this
nosotros como
is what
líderes
we,
tratar de ver los
as
mecanismos y
leaders,
las
need to
maneras que
find the
podemos
mechanisms and the
tener
ways
desde la universidad
where we can
o
implement from
desde
our
lo que
universities and
podemos
from
incidir en la política educativa y la
educational
política
policy
pública
and public
para que
policy
justamente se
to make these
visibilice
problems
esta
visible
problemática y se
and to
pueda
be able to
atender y por eso nuevamente felicitar al
attend to these
IESAL,
problems.
felicitar
That's
a
why
Daniele y su
I want to
equipo
congratulate
por el
Daniel and
estudio
his team again
exploratorio que
for this
esperemos que pueda
research study,
profundizarse
and
más
we
y que
want to encourage
podamos
them to dig
realmente
deeper and to
ir
generate from
generando
this
a partir de
knowledge
este
that
conocimiento
is
que se va a generar
generated solutions
soluciones
and
y
measures
medidas que nos
that
ayuden
will
realmente
allow
a
us to tend
atender
to
a esta
these
problemática
problems,
que es muy
which
importante y
which
que
are
no,
important
no
and
ha
has not
dejado de
stopped
existir, que si bien
existing.
quizás se,
We have
se han
maybe
logrado cosas,
achieved some results, but there
hay
is
muchas
still
cosas
a long way
aún
to
por
go.
lograr.
Muchas
Thank you very
gracias,
much, Professor
profesora Canese.
Canese.
Yo creo
I
que ha
think
insistido con toda la razón
you're right
en el aspecto de la
about
invisibilización
visualization of
de
this
este
phenomena.
fenómeno, ¿no? Y creo
And I
que
think implicitly,
implícitamente
when
cuando se ha
it comes
referido, por
to
ejemplo,
the
al
role that
papel
some
que
men
algunos
adopt,
hombres adoptan,
it's
es
true
cierto que,
that maybe we
digamos, tal
don't
vez
see
no
the
vemos las
situations,
situaciones,
but it
pero
doesn't
eso
make
no
us
nos hace
less
menos
guilty.
culpables. Es decir,
Our
nuestra obligación
responsibility is to
es
respect
respetar
human
los
rights to
derechos
begin
humanos,
with, and
para
the
empezar. Y el
lack of knowledge
desconocimiento
is
no
not
sirve, yo creo, y ese es un mensaje
an
que
excuse,
tomo
and this
en
is
primera
a
persona.
message that
El
I give to
desconocimiento,
myself:
la
the lack of
falta de
knowledge, the lack of
formación o de
understanding,
concientización
the lack of
que tal vez
conscientization,
en algunos casos, como
and
el
awareness.
de las
Some people
personas de mi
of a
generación se
generation
explica por
because
falta
of
de
lack of
educación no
education,
nos
we
exime de
explain, my
culpa, ¿no? Y
generation
creo
explains
que
it in a certain
es
way
responsabilidad
due
de
to lack of
todos, también
education,
de
but it
nosotros,
doesn't
conseguir
it
el
doesn't make
segundo
us
punto
less
al que antes se
guilty.
refería,
You've talked about,
y que ha sido evocado
and the other
también por las
panelists have
otras
talked about
panelistas,
an
un
environment,
entorno
a
de
work
trabajo
environment where we
donde
can
se
breathe
respire
that
seguridad.
safety.
Mejor dicho, si me permite, vayamos un
Let's
paso
take
más
it a step
allá,
further.
se experiencie o se experimente
Well-being.
bienestar, que en definitiva
This is
es
what
lo
we
que
should
debemos
have in
tener en
any
cualquier
social
institución
institution, and
social, ¿no?
that's
Y
why there's
también ha
been an
puesto el
emphasis
énfasis en algo
on
que habrá
something
que
that on a
dejar para
topic
otro
that we have to
momento,
leave it
que
for
es la
another time, but
discusión
it's the
con
discussion
respecto
about
a
public
las
policy,
políticas públicas,
which
que en el fondo es
it's a
también
way
una
of
manera de
reminding us that
recordarnos
many of
que
the things that
muchas de las
happen
cosas
within
que pasan dentro
the
de
walls
las
of
paredes de las
universities
universidades son
reflect
un
sometimes
reflejo a veces
it's a
amplificado, a
an
veces
amplified or
visualizado de situaciones de
of
desequilibrios, de
of
desventajas, de inequidades
inequalities,
que están fuera de
disadvantages
la
which are
universidad
outside
y que
the
se reproducen ahí, ¿no?
universities
Por
and that
ejemplo, usted se ha
reproduces
referido
there.
a un caso
You've talked
muy
about a
doloroso, ¿no? En el
painful
caso, por
case
ejemplo,
about
de
this
esta
young
joven
student
estudiante,
where
pues en
she got
definitiva
pregnant,
embarazada, ¿no? Y lo que esto comporta de sí, de
and
incapacidad
how
de que la universidad pueda
university
acoger
is unable
esa
to support
situación
the
de una
situation in a
manera
respectful
más
way.
respetuosa, lógicamente, ¿no? En fin, yo creo
I,
que
I believe
hemos
that we've
nada más que
had very
tenido
little
tiempo
time
de
to
rascar un poco sobre
scratch
la
the surface,
superficie, pero
and
no quiero
I don't want
agotar
to
el
run out of
tiempo. En
time. We
principio
had
teníamos solo una hora
an
de
hour,
programa,
we've been
una hora
going
y
at it
media.
for
Creo que
an hour and a
podríamos
half,
seguir
but we can
hablando,
carry
pero
on
si
talking
les
about
parece,
this. But
les
I want
emplazo
to
a
encourage you
dos
to think
cosas
about
más.
two
La
more
primera
things.
es,
Let's
vamos a
work with
trabajar con el
Daniel's team
equipo
to
de Daniele
guarantee
para
that
garantizar
this
que este estudio
explorative
exploratorio
research
vuelve a
can
reabrir la
open
encuesta,
again,
¿verdad?
and we
Y
open the
apoyarnos
survey
más
again, and
todavía
to
para
support each
intentar
other to have a
conseguir un
big
número mayor
number of
de respuestas, ¿no?
responses.
Realmente sorprendente. Y
And I
creo
believe that
que
the
la baja tasa de
low
respuestas
response
tiene que
has to
ver
do
con el
with
rechazo
rejection to the
a la mera
existence of the
existencia
phenomena
de
of
ese fenómeno
violence
de
in
la violencia
universities.
en la universidad, ¿no?
It's
Es
like
como
saying,
decir, no,
well,
no,
I don't want to
yo no
talk
voy a
about this, I'm not
responder
going to
porque esto no
answer this
existe,
is
yo no
because this
lo,
doesn't
¿no?
happen.
Que, por ejemplo, que es lo que yo
I
mismo
confess
confesé haber
I have
experimentado, ¿no? Eso es lo primero. Y lo
experienced this. And
segundo
the second
es
thing
que
is we need
necesitamos
to
ir un
go
poco más allá. Es
further.
decir,
We need to
compartir el diagnóstico es importante, pero sobre
work
todo tenemos que trabajar
with
con
you, with the
ustedes,
three of
con
you, and with
ustedes
other
tres y con
people
otras
to
personas también en un poco la
create
propuesta de, si me
proposals,
permite la
if
expresión, de
to have
hoja de
a
ruta, ¿verdad? ¿Qué
pathway,
se
a
supone que deberían
roadmap
hacer
per se.
instituciones por una
What
parte
should
y
we do as
gobiernos por otra para
institutions and as
garantizar que
governments to
generamos
generate
ese
that
ambiente,
environment, not just a
digamos, no
safe
solo
environment,
seguro,
but
sino un ambiente
an
de
environment of
bienestar
well-being
para
for
todas las
all the
personas
people
que
who
trabajan
work
en las
in
instituciones de
higher
educación superior.
education
Volveré en unos
institutions.
minutos más
I'll
adelante,
come back in
pero
a few minutes,
quiero
but I want to
agradecerles de
thank you
nuevo
again for
sus
your thoughts
perspectivas
and
y emplazarles
to
a la continuidad de este seminario que
encourage you to continue
probablemente
this
tenga lugar
seminar
cuando Daniele
when
nos
maybe
comparta
that will
ya
maybe take place when
resultados
Daniel can
más
give us more
ampliados.
concrete
Le
results.
devuelvo sin más la palabra
Sarah,
a
please go
Sara.
ahead.
Adelante.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias
Thanks
al
to our
panel
panelists
y al
and
doctor Pedro.
to Dr.
Y
Pedro.
ahora, como
And
estamos
as
muy
we're
cortos
short
de
of time, we're
tiempo,
going to
vamos a
move on to our
pasar a
second
nuestra
question.
segunda pregunta de
Second
Menti,
menti
que es
question,
muy
which is
importante
important
para el
for the public.
público.
We
Nos
want them
interesa que la
to
respondan.
answer this. The
La
question that
pregunta que
we're
ahora
going to
vamos a
show now
proceder a mostrar es:
is,
¿cree
do
que
you
su
believe your institution
institución
has
ha
developed the
desarrollado
correct
las
tools,
herramientas apropiadas
appropriate tools to
para
prevent
prevenir la
gender
violencia
violence?
de género?
Do you believe
¿Cree
that
que
your
su
institution
institución
has
ha
developed
desarrollado las
the
herramientas
appropriate tools
apropiadas
to
para
prevent
prevenir la
gender
violencia
violence?
de género? Pueden ir mientras ustedes van respondiendo
As you
esta segunda
answer
pregunta que
the second
adelantamos. Vamos a
question,
adelantar el código
here is the
y la
code
dirección
and
de
the
Menti en
Menti
nuestro chat. Les leo
address.
el código igual.
The code
Es
is 26449954.
26449954.
Do you
¿Cree
believe
que su
that your
institución
institution
ha
has developed the
desarrollado las
appropriate tools
herramientas
to prevent
apropiadas para
gender-based
prevenir la
violence?
violencia de género?
We're
Les
just going to
damos
give you a
tiempo para que
few minutes
la
to answer
vayan
these.
respondiendo y vamos a ver si podemos
And
compartir
we're going to
los
try and
resultados de
share
la
the
primera
results to the
pregunta
first
que ya
question
habíamos pasado por el chat al inicio de
that we
este
asked on the
encuentro.
chat at the beginning of this
A ver si podemos
conference.
ver los
Let's see if we can
resultados
display the results
mientras ustedes van preparando
whilst
la
you are
la
preparing
respuesta a esta segunda
the
pregunta.
answer. Here is the second question.
No sé si tenemos el
I don't
resultado
know
de
if we have the results
la
for the first
primera. Creo que ahí
question. Here
viene.
we are.
se han
These are the
encontrado, este es el
results
resultado de la
for the
primera
first question.
pregunta.
Have you
¿Se ha
ever
encontrado
found
alguna
yourself
vez
in
en
a
una
situation of
situación de violencia de
gender-based
género
violence
en su
in your
institución?
institution?
Tenemos
15
15
said no
respuestas
and
que no y
26 have said
26 que
yes.
sí.
Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias. Entonces, creo que con esto les
We're just going to
dejamos
give you a bit of
tiempo
time to
para que
answer the
vayan
second
respondiendo a
question.
la segunda pregunta y
And
le damos paso al director
Sí,
para el
perfecto.
cierre y conclusiones.
The
Muchas
director now
gracias.
has the
Luego
floor
volvemos con la
for the
respuesta de la segunda.
closing.
Muy bien. Muy
Again, just
rápidamente, de
briefly,
nuevo insistir en que
I
es
want to insist on
importante
the fact that it's
que
important for you
respondan
to answer
a
this
esta
question.
pregunta, porque yo
I
creo que
believe
la
that the
principal
main conclusion we
conclusión
can
que podemos
extract today
extraer
is
hoy es doble.
twofold.
En primer lugar, que
First of all,
todo tiene
everything
que
has to
ver
do
con
with
la educación.
education.
En definitiva,
What
lo
we
que recogemos en las aulas
have from
universitarias probablemente se
universities
gesta en el mismo momento
is
en que nacen las
born
personas, ¿no?
in
En
the
el
context
contexto
where
en
they're
que
born,
nacen y
in
en la
the
educación
family
familiar
context,
y
and
en el paso por
when they go
el
through
preescolar, por la
preschool,
escuela. Es
school,
decir,
etc.,
vamos
we are
generando
generating a
una
culture per
cultura,
se,
por decirlo así, que puede ser
which
proclive al
can
respeto,
support or not support
digamos, a la no
respect
agresión,
or
o por el contrario,
non-aggression.
una cultura que, en
So
la que asociamos
cultures where we
distintos roles de
associate
género a
gender-based
situaciones de
roles to
poder.
situations of power,
Por
and I
esto
don't
no
want
quiero
to
excusar
excuse,
que esa es
this is the
la
second
segunda
conclusion,
conclusión,
I
no
don't
quiero
want to make
excusar ni mucho menos
excuses for the absence
la
of
ausencia de
action
acción por
on behalf
parte
of
de las
higher
instituciones de
education
educación superior.
institutions.
Probablemente debemos, digamos, acompañar
From my
yo desde el
institution,
instituto
and
y
of course with
lógicamente
the
con
three
estas
people
tres
who
personas
are
que me
accompanying
acompañan,
me,
pero estoy
but
seguro
I'm sure
con el
with
resto
the rest of the
de
members
los
of the
miembros del
government
Consejo de
council,
Gobierno,
we
creo que
need
debemos
to
acompañar a las instituciones de educación
accompany the
superior de la región
regional
justamente en la
institutions in
adopción de
developing
herramientas
tools
que
that
permitan no
allow
solo
not just to
prevenir,
prevent and to
concienciar,
give awareness to, but
digamos,
also
seguir
to
educando
carry
a
on
las personas
educating people
independientemente de
independently
su
of their
orientación
gender
de
orientation,
género en esa cultura
to
del
educate them
respeto
in a
que
culture of
que
respect
debe
that
hacer
should make
que una
that
institución
a
universitaria sea un
university
espacio de
institution
paz, un
should be a
espacio de
space of
bienestar,
well-being
pero que
and
debemos
peace. We
también
should also
progresar
advance in
en
something
algo
that
de
we
lo que no hemos tenido
haven't
tiempo de
had time
tratar
to
hoy,
talk about
que es,
today.
bueno,
What
¿y
are
qué hacen las
universities doing when
universidades cuando
someone
alguien se atreve a
speaks
levantar
out
la voz
and
y a
says,
decir, ha pasado
this is
esto o
happening?
está pasando esto, ¿no?
What
¿Qué se
are we
supone
supposed
que
to do?
deben
What
hacer?
are the
¿Cuáles son
good
las buenas
practices that we
prácticas que
can
podemos
rescue
rescatar de
from the
los
different
distintos
countries
países
and
y
from the
de las
different institutions?
distintas instituciones, ¿no?
And
Y en tercer
third,
lugar, yo
just
creo
to
que para
close
cerrar
the
el ciclo no
cycle,
solo
it's
se
not just
trata
about
de
preventing and
prevenir y
acting
de actuar
when it comes to
cuando se trata justamente de detectar
impacting these
estos
phenomena
fenómenos
or
o estos
these
episodios de
violence
violencia,
episodes, but
sino más allá, yo creo,
further on, we
inevitablemente
need
tenemos
to
que
think
pensar en la
about the
tercera
third
misión
mission of higher
de la educación
education, which is
superior, que
to
es
have
justamente tener
and to
un
make
impacto
a social
social, ¿no?
impact.
Entonces,
What
¿qué
can we
podemos
do
hacer para
to
garantizar
guarantee
que nos
what
proponemos en
that
nuestras
we're implementing our
prácticas, en la
practices in
forma
the
en
way
que
we work this
trabajamos
type
este
of
tipo de cuestiones
issues
para
to
justamente
promote
promover un
social
cambio
change,
social
which is
mucho más amplio,
bigger
¿no? En las
in communities
comunidades en
where
las
we're
que
working,
trabajamos y en los
in the
países,
countries where we
digamos,
are.
a los que nos debemos, ¿no? Sin más,
Without
por tanto,
further ado,
ojalá pudiéramos haber dicho que hemos concluido hoy, ¿verdad? Pero creo que lo único que
I
hemos
think
hecho, y
Danielle
Daniele lo ha hecho muy bien,
has
muchísimas
done
gracias a
this
ella
really
y a
well.
su equipo, ha sido ni más ni menos que
We've
compartir el
basically just
aperitivo
managed
de lo que
to
tiene que ser una labor mucho más
share the
profunda en este
start
sentido
of
y
this
a la
topic,
que
and I
les
want to
invito a todos
invite
y a
all of
todas
you
a
to
participar en el
take
futuro. De
part
nuevo,
in future.
muchísimas
Thank you very
gracias
much
a
to
las
all the panel
panelistas,
members and
muchísimas
to
gracias a
Danielle
Daniele y ya de paso,
and
muchísimas
to the
gracias al equipo
institute
del
team
instituto
that
que hace
makes this
posible esta actividad. Te
a
devuelvo la palabra,
possibility.
Sara.
Thank you very much,
Muchísimas
Director.
gracias, director. Bueno, mientras
As we show the
mostramos los
results to the
resultados de
second
la segunda
question, I'm going
pregunta,
to
yo
draw
voy a
to a
ir
close,
cerrando para no ocupar más el tiempo de las
as not
agendas
to
de
take
todos ustedes.
more of your time.
Gracias a todos
Thank you
los
for
que nos
accompanying us.
acompañan.
Well, we
Bueno,
have
ya
here,
tenemos acá
do you believe
que
that
esta
your
institución
institution
ha
has developed
desarrollado
the
las herramientas
correct tools, the
apropiadas
appropriate
para
tools to
prevenir
prevent
la
gender
violencia de
violence,
género? Tenemos
gender-based violence?
25
25 said
respuestas
no
no
and
y
7 said
7
yes.
sí. Entonces, con
So with
esta imagen
this
en
image
pantalla,
on
nos
the
vamos
screen, we are
despidiendo.
drawing to a
Gracias a nuestros
close.
panelistas y a los
Thanks to all the
participantes que
panel
hoy nos
members and to
acompañaron
those
en este
that have
acto
shared in
conmemorativo del Día Internacional de
this
la Mujer
commemorative
2023,
event for
que para
International
nosotros
Women's
y
Day
esperamos que para ustedes
2023. We
también
hope it's
no
not
acabe
over
hoy.
today. tomorrow we will have a new online event called The Participation of Women in Higher Education in Africa, to understand the regional picture. It's a study of 9 countries in South Africa to understand the roles for women in education, higher education systems. You are cordially invited to go to the webpage where you will find more information about this and other events. And soon you'll find in YouTube, in the recording rooms, this online seminar in 2 languages, in both languages. Thank you very much for being a part of UNESCO IESAL, and thank you for accompanying us in this, in celebrating our 25th anniversary, 25 years promoting higher education for everyone. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Muchísimas
Thank
gracias.
you all. A round of thank you.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias, feliz día.
Gracias.
Gracias, Sara. Chao, chao.
Felicidades.